Welcome to Thinking with the Stars. I'm your host, Soul Cancer. In my previous two videos, there was an adherence of the interviews to some larger story that was demonstrated to us by the social planets, Saturn and Jupiter. I was able to go through the interviews chronologically from the least recent to the most recent, and there was some kind of story arc that would be revealed, basically because I was talking about how Mars was in a square I was talking about how Mars was in a square aspect to Jupiter and Saturn, and that was conducive to having a storyline that made a lot of sense. This week's episode is more pertaining to the aspect of Venus and Mars, which are known as personal planets. And so when Venus and Mars make aspects to each other, they tend to reveal something more psychological and not quite the sociological impact that Saturn and Jupiter had. So here I'm looking not at the text of the interviews, but more the subtext, if I wanted to uncover some kind of connection between the interviews and the planetary aspect of Mars and Mars square Venus. In the video description this week, I'll include the zodiac signs and Palladian houses that the planets were in during the time of the interview. Jeffrey and his interviewees were professionals, and that implied that they could put aside personal issues of the sort that would crop up if you were doing an interview when Venus was square Mars. And as professionals ourselves, we can imagine being asked to defend a thesis or teach a class during a personal crisis. This was very much indicative of the military mindset that's common among Western academics. And what I'm hoping for is a resurgence of right-brained artistic merit in those fields. So very much there were two stories. One would be the front-loaded story, which I had when I examined the aspects, the Placidian houses and the zodiac signs that the planets Mars and Venus were in during the interviews. I was able to glean some sort of insight into what kind of psychologically would be what we could look for psychologically from the interviewees. But what I found was that the interviews themselves told their own compelling story, and I intend to tell that story in reverse, going from the most recent interview to the least recent interview. And the reason why I would do that is because the most recent interview touches on a lot of the themes that will tend to crop up in the as we're going backwards in time to the more least recent interviews. So I mean, there is a question there, like I remember from Jose Saramago's book The Double, that the main character asked, the question was, should history be taught from beginning to end or from the end to the beginning, And this is the same thing with this interview. We're talking about Tibetan Buddhism. It was on September 4th, 2020. Jeffrey conducted an interview with Serena Roney Dougal. It was entitled Tibetan Buddhist Psychic Traditions. And she touches on the fact that Buddhists believe in reincarnation, for instance. So, Serena's research was asked the question, did psychic abilities increase incrementally, or were people struck suddenly with the ability to, I think it's clairvoyance mostly, ability to see the future like the oracles of Tibet. She discovered that those born with the gifts of psychic abilities were far less reliable than those who cultivated the gift through daily meditation. The oracles and the monks, they had ones who had been meditating for 15 years or more. They oftentimes they were considered to be infallible. So these sorts of meditation practices that help us cultivate psychic abilities would be things like reciting mantras, visualization, and maintaining a focused intention. So on that day, Venus was in Cancer in the 9th house, and it had made a square with Mars that was in Aries in the 6th house. With these aspects, it was possible to create fundamental change, but first we needed to understand something. Bodhisattva practice, for instance, involved sending healing thoughts to someone you were close to, healing thoughts to an acquaintance, and then healing thoughts to an enemy. On June 3rd, 2020, Jeffrey conducted an interview with Doug Marmon called The Soul's Journey. On this day, Venus was in Gemini and in the 3rd house. It was squared to Mars, who was in Pisces and in the 12th house. This aspect implied that in order to survive and to thrive, we scrambled to build awareness of our values and establish necessary relationships. So we're talking about the soul's journey. It's not only are we going to survive in this life, but it's also, are we going to become enlightened? That's what they're talking about. What I found that there's a duality here that was discussed in terms of our values. So there's our awareness of our values, and then there's our behavior, which was what we did to promote our values. And the problem is, as I see it, being consciously aware of our values. Okay, so if we were consciously aware of our values, everything would be so cloudy. We couldn't maintain that conscious awareness of our values. Something like money, that makes it quite easy to be rational and logical, is just to, run a computer program. How do I maximize the amount of dollars in my bank account? And I don't really have to think too much about anything else. But if we had values other than just pure greed, then it's going to be, now if we had values other than meeting our needs, or meeting the needs of our families, then it's going to be difficult to maintain awareness of those values while we're in the middle of acting, making choices. We kind of just tend to go with our gut instinct a lot of the times. So here I wanted to mention that I think it's important when we feel a powerful emotion to take a time out and think about what the value is that we hold that's motivating this emotion. And then we can come up with a plan to act in such a way that we're able to achieve the goal implied by that emotion. Now, this interview was about Doug coming of age, and he had made an assertion that as a youth, he decided to wait until he had evidence before he formed an opinion about the existence of God. Later, Doug had a vision in which he met himself, but he mistook himself for someone else. We understand the wisdom of others before we understand wisdom in ourselves. And it was important for us to recognize that we didn't have all the answers and we had much to learn. Now, on January 26, 2020, Jeffrey recorded an interview with Andy Hilton, and it was entitled Commenting. So here we're getting into, rather than kind of discussing spirituality, now we're discussing polarized issues such as fiscal conservatism, democratic socialism. Typically, academics were oriented towards socialism, and blue-collar folk were oriented towards capitalism. But I like to think that as a philosopher, we're kind of above those polarizing issues, and that we can discuss the merit of both positions. On the day, Venus was in Pisces in the 4th house, and it was squared to Mars, who was in Sagittarius in the 1st house. So front-loaded kind of message that I had picked up was that learning happened that affected the values of society. So not only do we learn on a personal level, but society learns as well. And in order to adjust to that, we made changes to our values and our relationships at home. So things change on the bigger picture, and then so our values and our relationships change on the bigger picture, and then our values and relationships change at home, and that's how we compensate for that. And it's pretty close to what Andy Hilton was talking about. He was talking about how families could operate as a shared resource, and there were certain goods that could be commoned. They get into the discussion a little bit deeper, where there's a tension between nationalists and globalists. And they mentioned that fear resulted from the projection of power onto groups that felt distanced from that power. So this is where we're talking about kind of like more a socialist society. And in the next interview, they get into it more, criticizing Stalinist communism. So Jeffrey mentioned, Muslims, Jews, women, Catholics, communists. They all had that kind of fear when they were. They had fear when they felt they were targeted by power. So Jeffrey mentioned Muslims, Jews, women, Catholics, etc. They all felt fear when they felt they were targeted by the powers that be. The kind of upshot that they came up to with was that awakening was the response to the alarmist scenario. So to that fear, there was kind of a bubbling up of things such as near-death experience stories, UFO contacts, and environmental causes that faced the prospect of extinction. And that if we increase our awareness of that, we become better off. On March 21st, 2019, Jeffrey recorded an interview with James P. Driscoll entitled Satan, Lucifer, and the Jungian Shadow. Venus was in Aquarius in the 10th house, and it was squared to Mars in Taurus in the 1st house. So the front-loaded message that I got from that aspect was that we could put energy into cultivating values, but it didn't always yield the results we expected because things were governed by rules, higher powers, for instance, that were difficult to bring under our control, right? So to prove this in the video, they were talking about how the guilt of an act was determined by the culture in which that act occurred. For instance, an immoral system such as Nazism or Stalinism, such as Nazism or communism, it could attribute guilt to us for breaking rules that were immoral. So this is kind of going back to this is a paradox known as dirty hands. That was also in philosophy is called the position in philosophy is called moral relativism. And the Trolley Paradox is where I could press a button to save 3 people, but it would put one to death. And that implied that I would make a choice to put one person to death in order to save the 3 people, which is an unsatisfactory conclusion. Mishlev and Driscoll eventually agreed that power should be mastered and put in the service of truth and love. On the 11th of October 2018, Jeffrey recorded an interview with James McLennan that was entitled The Sociology of Sorat. At this date, Venus was in the 3rd house, Scorpio, and it was squared with Mars in the 6th house in Aquarius. The front-loaded idea that I had surmised before I heard the video was that it was useful to put energy into our relationships and values, but we never really managed to achieve our goals completely. They were always kind of half fulfilled, and then we moved on to something else. The phenomena reported at Sorat greatly challenged our idea of reality, especially particle physics. There was table wraps, table movement, tables balanced on two legs, but when they attempted to replicate the phenomena under controlled conditions, they didn't get the same results. So what I took that to mean was that care and attention were necessary for us to find peace even after death. Validating phenomena by professionals gave the phenomena the attention it required, and the spirits were able to then let go. Confronting malicious phenomena caused it to crumble, and we were able to find freedom when we confronted our fears. So, not sure what else is to be said about the 5 interviews we spoke about. Thanks very much for watching. I'm Soul Cancer, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye for now.